We just stepped on their face with a hobnail boot and broke their nose. We just crushed their face.
What's up, guys? Welcome back in here to the Glory UGA Blitz. With the holidays and the trip to New Orleans for the Sugar Bowl, and then me getting the flu in New Orleans and being down for the count for a week or so with a 102-degree temperature and unable to actually speak in complete sentences without sounding like fingers being drawn on a chalkboard. It's been a minute. It's been a minute since I've been here with you guys on the YouTube channel. So if you're new to the channel, finding us for the first time, first off, welcome. This is the Glory UGA Blitz. We do the Glory UGA podcast. Been doing it for 10 football seasons now. You can find our longer version episodes wherever you get your podcast. We do 4 episodes a week during the season. We do 2 to 3 during the off season, depending on what's going on. Right now, we got 3 episodes a week for you this month. A lot of stuff going on in the world of Georgia football, Georgia basketball, Georgia athletics at large. So make sure to check us out wherever you get your podcasts. I am Tyler, and this show is brought to you by our great friends at MyBookie. But yeah, it's been a minute. It's been a minute since I've been on here with you guys, and there's been a lot of things that have gone down. Obviously, we lost Sugar Bowl. We got some transfer portal news. There's a lot that we've talked about, we've discussed on the actual podcast, but the biggest news in the world of Georgia football over the past week or so, really the past 4 or 5 days or so, is the news that I think hit on Thursday, that Carson Beck decided to enter the NCAA transfer portal and maybe, possibly, probably, clearly at this point now, with more information we have, not go to the NFL draft after all, which is what he initially said a couple of weeks back. And I did an entire episode, at least a half of an episode, at the end of last week, breaking down my instant reaction thoughts to that. So you can go and check that out again wherever you get your podcast. But today, what I want to address is what this means for Georgia next year moving forward. And before I say anything, because I know there's going to be people out there saying, oh, you're just a homer, sour grapes, blah, blah, blah. Like, it's inevitable. People are going to say that. That's fine. But I want to start by saying this. I think Carson Beck's a good quarterback. I still think he's a good quarterback, and there are a lot of fans in the Georgia fan base after this year would probably fight with me on that. But I still think he's a really good quarterback. I think in Miami he's going to put up big numbers in the ACC. They got a lot of talent. They got pretty much more talent than anybody not named Clemson, maybe more talent than Clemson in that conference. So I imagine Carson will put up some big numbers. The guy's I still think he's an elite processor. He's going to do some really good things there at Miami, and I wish him the best, as long as that best does not come at the expense of the University of Georgia. But saying that, even though I still do think Carson Beck is a good quarterback, I think a lot of the issues that he had this year in Athens were related to the receiver position, the offensive line. Certainly Carson has some limitations athletically, and that hurts when you play behind an offensive line, at least at the tackle position. It's not great. We were banged up on the interior. Ratledge missed some time. Dylan Fairchild was banged up most of the year. Jerry Wilson, the center, missed some time early in the year. So the offensive line was never fully healthy, and we were never elite at tackle. So when you got some speed rushers and you get pressure in your face, Carson's not a guy that's going to be able to escape the pocket and create things on the move. That's just not what that guy does. So his limitations, combined with some of the deficiencies we had on the offensive line at tackle, especially on the receiver position, combined to certainly create 2024 that I think he would sooner rather forget. It certainly was not up to the par of what we saw in 2023. But yes, Carson Beck, I still think he's a good quarterback. But saying that, I do think at the same time, I know some of you will say I'm speaking out of two sides of my mouth. He's good. I still think Carson's good. But at the same time, I do think Georgia is better off with Carson Beck choosing to go to Miami and not come back to Georgia next year. Hear me out on this, all right? I know that seems kind of counterintuitive. It seems like I'm kind of like contradicting myself there. But I think both things can be true here. And here's why. Hear me out on this. I think it's a multifaceted explanation here. Number one, look at the money Carson Beck got to go to Miami. Reportedly, we don't fully know. You never really know these things. But the reports are $4 million is what he got in NIL money just to go to Miami. And then the reports later in the weekend, upwards near $10 million total compensation and endorsement. So whatever way you want to cut it, $4 million from the university, probably $4 million from their collectives, what I'd imagine, and then another $6 million from various boosters or companies related to Miami that aren't directly tied to their collective, however they want to structure that. But the dude got a bag, all right? We can suffice it to say he got a lot of money. And look, like I said last week on the show, You can go check it out. I don't begrudge Carson Beck. I get it. I get why it's going. There's a lot of reasons why it's going. His girlfriend, obviously, number one, but he was never going to get that kind of money at Georgia following the performance that he had last year. And Georgia is just not in a position like Miami where I don't think we need him as much when you got a guy like Gunnar Stockton who performed admirably in a really tough spot, starting that first game of his career in the Sugar Bowl against a really good Notre Dame defense, and I thought he played pretty well, all things considered, in that game. So I don't think Georgia's in as much of dire straits at that position as maybe Miami is when you're losing Cam Ward. You go from Cam Ward to Emory Jones or Emory Williams, whoever it is. Emory something or another that they've got to work with, who's fine, but I mean, come on, you're not winning. You're not competing for a national title with that guy. I think it's pretty clear. You've seen that at this point when you've seen him come to the game. So yeah, they're going to be willing to pay him more than Georgia. So that's simple. And if it came down to will Georgia match the NIL, I'm glad that we didn't, right? Because that's a lot of money to pay for a guy who I still think is good. And like I said this last week, I would still love to have Carson Beck on our roster. If there was some way we could work out to have Carson Beck and Gunnar Stockton on our roster to compete with each other, you want as much talent at that position on your roster as you can possibly have. But that's also a fantasy land. If Carson came back, there's also a really good chance that Gunnar's going to leave. We'll get that in a second here. But when it comes to NIL, if it's $4 million, if that's what it would have taken to get Carson to come back, and it might have taken more than that because you're also competing with the fact that his girlfriend's down there. So if it's $4 or $5, $6 million, whatever it is, I'm glad that we did not pay that because we can use that money. Because we have deficiencies on this roster. We have a lot of talent, as much talent as maybe 3 or 4 teams in this country, but there's still some areas that we need to fix. And we've taken some steps in doing that, certainly at the wide receiver position. But you lose Damon Wilson Jr. You want to try to go out and find an impact edge. You want to maybe find some offensive linemen if they're out there. Those guys are hard to find. Maybe potentially another quarterback to come in that maybe doesn't cost as much. But there are other areas that you want to try to address in this team. If you don't address them through the transfer portal this cycle or in the spring window, maybe you start to address them in this next 2026 recruiting class. So there are a number of ways that we could use that money that I think could help us address some of the other deficiencies we have on our roster. Because part of that is like if you want to get better receivers, if you want to get better offensive tackles, if you want to find an impact edge player, you've got to pay those guys. That's just the way it is. And look, I know that the revenue sharing is probably coming as soon as this house settlement gets finalized. Whenever that happens, I don't know. It's probably coming. So that'll certainly make the landscape look a little bit different. But right now, we're operating this NIL environment. So you got to have money to pay all these guys. So that does free up some more NIL money when you have a perfectly, I think, suitably good option, at the very least good. I think what we know with Gunnar Stockton right now is that he has a high floor. The ceiling remains to be seen. Does he have an elite ceiling? That remains to be seen. I'm encouraged by what I saw at the end of the season, and I'm hopeful that with a full year being the guy, working with the number one offense, and get some experience that way, that he will be able to raise that ceiling. But at the very least, we have a very good, solid option. If you put players around him at the receiver position, offensive line, which you can use with that money that you would otherwise pay Carson Beck, then you might really have something on the Georgia offense. So that's number one. From an NIL standpoint, it's a no-go for me. It's just too much money. And then speaking of the offensive line, so we saw very clearly at the end of the season, in a big way in the Sugar Bowl, obviously, there were some major deficiencies on the Georgia offensive line, specifically at tackle. We're also losing 3 of our best offensive linemen. I would say that the 3 interior guys with Jerry Wilson, Tate Ratliff, Joe Fairchild, those are probably our 3 best offensive linemen last year. All 3 of those guys are going off the NFL. They're gone. We do have 2 of the 3 tackles that played last year coming back, and one of them, Ernest Green, was banged up for most of the year. It's really probably more of a guard, so I think we'll probably move him to right tackle, which fits him better than left tackle, which he's playing the first year and a half of his career. And then you've got Monroe Freeling, who I still think is a really talented player. He's just still got to grow, get bigger, stronger, more experienced out there. But I do like the athleticism. I like the lean. I think his best football is ahead of him, although I know it's a bad look in the Sugar Bowl. But still, there's going to be a transition on the Georgia offensive line. I think that we have some really, really talented young players, but they're young. They're inexperienced, and it's probably going to take some time for them to gel, whatever combination we have up there. And when you're working in a new offensive line like that might or might not be as good as the one that we had this year. And this year, we obviously had a lot of issues at times, even with some of these players that are going to be playing in the NFL next year. When you're talking about a guy like Carson Beck, who is he's a pure pocket passer. When Carson Beck is given a clean pocket, he's an elite processor. He's an elite dude from the pocket when he has a clean pocket. But when he doesn't have a clean pocket, things break down, which happened far too often. At the Florida game, all 3 of those picks I trace back to pressure in his face. That's when he really starts to struggle. Well, if our offensive line, if he had issues this year behind that offensive line, Next year, is it going to be any better? I'm hopeful, but we don't know that. But what we can say with Gunnar Stockton is while he might not be a Jalen Milroe level athlete, the quarterback, no one's saying that, but he is much more athletic and much more capable outside the pocket and can stress defenses more outside the pocket when things break down. It's more capable of creating when things break down than Carson Beck ever was and ever will be. So if you have an offensive line that's going to be a work in progress early in the year, which it probably will be to some degree or another, it makes more sense to have a quarterback back there. If it is going to be Gunnar Stockton, even if it's Ryan Puglisi, who has an outside shot to maybe win that job, he's athletic in his own right. He's more athletic than Carson Beck is. Those two guys, certainly Gunnar, have more ability to create when things break down, if things break down with a younger, inexperienced offensive line. So I think that's another reason, like, yeah, Carson's good when he has a clean pocket, but how much is that going to happen early this year, all right? And then let's go back to if Carson decided to come back to Georgia, what does that mean for Gunnar Stockton? Well, no one knows for sure. He's a Georgia kid. Maybe he's been patient. Maybe he waits another year. Maybe, because maybe he's like, this is for sure the last year of Carson Beck, and the next year it's my job. Maybe he waits around, but also maybe he doesn't. We already saw that with Brock Vandegrift. Maybe he decides to take his ball and go elsewhere, and who could blame him in that scenario? So what you would say is you're basically trading 1 year of Carson Beck, which certainly does have more knowns. You have more of an idea of what Carson Beck is, and he is not. Gunnar, we kind of know what he is, but there's a chance he could be even more than what we've seen so far with more time as the number one guy. But you're trading 1 year of Carson Beck potentially for 2 years of Gunnar. Now, Gunnar could have an incredible year this year and go pro. It'd be his fourth year in the system, fourth year out of high school, so he could go pro. I don't know if Gunnar's that type of guy. I don't know if he's an NFL guy after 1 year. I'm going to be a first-round draft pick kind of guy. I'd be as high enough of a draft stock kind of guy that he would leave after 1 year. So I think, Gunnar, we've got 2 more years with him. All right? So if you bring Carson Beck back and he transfers, you're trading 1 year 2 years of Gunnar Stockton for 1 year of Carson Beck. And then after Carson Beck, maybe you're really high on Ryan Puglisi and you're fine. Maybe. But maybe you're not. I don't know. So if you think you have something with Gunnar Stockton, if the coaches believe in Gunnar, like Kirby said after the SEC championship game, this guy's a winner. If you really truly believe that, if you've seen enough from him, they've seen a lot more of Gunnar than we have. I've had my questions about Gunnar, have been encouraged by what I saw the past 6 quarters of football. But if you believe in that guy, I think you'd probably rather have 2 years of him than 1 year of Carson Beck. Probably. That's calculus you have to make there. And I think the coaches probably, and I think they were caught off guard by what I understand, but I think that's probably part of the thinking there. And here's the final part. I think this might be the biggest reason why Georgia's actually going to be better off next year with Gunnar Stockton, Ryan Puglisi, whoever it ends up being, rather than Carson Beck. Carson Beck, I think you can say by and large, lost the Georgia fan base this year. Not everybody, but I don't think it's a stretch to say the Georgia fan base at large segments of it at least, turned against Carson Beck this year. And I don't think that's complete without justification. I do think that he took more heat than he probably deserved, but he certainly made more than his fair share of mistakes. I think some of the heat was certainly justified and earned, was a little over the top at times. I tend to think so, but, people can feel how they want to feel. But the bottom line is there are a lot of people in Georgia fan base that are out on Carson Beck. He took a lot of heat this year. I think one of the reasons, obviously, NIL is a big factor, girlfriend's a big factor. I think another factor of why he didn't come back to Georgia, why we weren't really an option, is I think he was up in his feelings. I don't mean that disrespectfully. I think that the criticism he got affected him. Because think about this, guys, this is not Stetson Bennett, who's been doubted every turn of his life forever because he's small, undersized, he's not a college football player, right? Who's just used to that and uses it as fuel. This is a guy that's never been criticized like that. You go back to his high school years, his first year as a starter at Mandarin High School. That was a school in Jacksonville that had never experienced really any kind of football success. He leads them to their first state title. He's the school's hero. Then he comes into college and he waits a couple years. It's kind of an afterthought. He's behind Stetson Bennett. He's not doing much, but he's certainly not getting criticism. In fact, when he gets some playing time in 2022 in garbage time, he looks really good enough to give people confidence that when it was his turn in 2023, including yours truly, we were all in on Carson Beck. This guy's going to be great. We got no doubts. He's going to be awesome. And then 2023 goes great. And he gets all this love as a potential number 1 overall NFL draft guy. And it's certainly a first rounder. And there was a time in the offseason when he was the betting favorite to win the Heisman Trophy. So this guy got all the praise in 2023 and in the offseason leading in 2024. And then 2024 comes. And pretty quickly, he faces adversity. And criticism comes his way, I think, for the first time maybe ever as a college football player, as a quarterback, even going back to high school. And some guys like Stetson Bennett of the world, they feed off of that. They want that. They need that chip on their shoulder. The criticism, the doubt, it's fuel for them. They almost can't operate without it. That's one kind of guy. Then the other kind of guy like Carson Beck, who, when they get criticized like that, like they internalize it. And it affects them. You could see it in Carson Beck's face. I mean, you could see the body language out there. At times, it's a very different guy than what we saw last year. Not just in terms of performance, but just the body language out there. In the Florida game, guys, I mean, I thought the guy was going to break down in tears on the sideline. I don't mean any disrespect by that. I thought that there was a chance he might. So it clearly affected him. There's no doubt about that. And it got toxic at times throughout the year. I don't know how many times I got asked, like, what's wrong with Carson Beck? What's wrong with Carson Beck? We had to do an episode here. What's wrong with Carson Beck? Talking about it all throughout the season. So I will say he did improve his play as the season went on. And I'll give him credit. He fought through that adversity and was much better at the end of the year, helped us win the Georgia Tech game. I don't think we win that game without him. But then you're Carson Beck, and you see, like, when you go out in the SEC championship game, and then you see the way Gunnar Stockton is embraced by not just his teammates, but the coaching staff, what they have to say about him after the game, the narrative all around him, and then the narrative also includes you, like, well, he's just, he's different than Carson Beck. He's just a different kind of guy. Like, the teammates are behind him. They're cheering for this guy. It's just more of like a natural born leader kind of thing. And you're sitting there the whole time saying, like, dude, I did a lot of good things for Georgia. And you feel kind of like you were pushed to the side. So if he does come back to Georgia, let's say the money was too good to pass up, we offered him NIL money, and he comes back. Look, guys, our schedule's going to be really tough again next year. I know we have those games at home, but it's still going to be a really tough schedule next year. Auburn's going to be better next year. That's on the road. That's not going to be a gimme game. It's a tough schedule. So invariably, at some point in the season, if he came back to Georgia, he's going to face more adversity. He's going to have a bad game, a bad stretch here or there with the teams that we have to play. What is going to happen the very first time Carson Beck starts to struggle if he came back to Georgia next year? The boo birds are going to come out in full force. The hate's going to come back out. People are going to turn on him again. It's going to get more toxic than ever, right? And we saw how he handled it last year. He didn't always handle it well. And this is it. Like, there's no like, oh, I can maybe come back next year. And he sees his NFL draft stock going down the tubes again. And it's like, I mean, he could spiral and it could be very, very bad. All right. So you have a guy that I think the fan base, they would probably have gotten behind. Like, yeah, all right, he's our guy again. But again, at the first sign of adversity, like when he starts to struggle, this is not a guy that gets the benefit of the doubt from Georgia. He's not a Georgia guy. There's not that built-in affinity for him the way there is for a guy like Gunnar Stockton, who's the favorite son, homegrown boy, country boy, driving his pickup around with no AC and no power windows, right? Like, you have that built-in affinity for him. So you're probably going to be willing to allow him some struggles in a way that you probably wouldn't Carson Beck. And it's not going to get as toxic as fast as it would if things don't go right away as it might with Carson Beck when he, again, and I think invariably probably would face some struggles at some point next year. So I do think that Gunnar Stockton coming in, it kind of not just, it doesn't just bring the fan base and get them behind your quarterback, but the teammates too. Like, they were clearly behind this guy. And I don't want to say that Carson Beck was locker room cancer. I don't know any of that. I've never really heard that directly from anyone I know here on the program in Athens. But it's pretty clear the way that they got behind Gunnar Stockton after the SEC championship game, that they do believe in this guy in maybe a little bit of a different way. And I do think that matters. You're talking about the quarterback position. Carson Beck was just a different dude. It's, for better or worse, just a different kind of guy. There's no doubt about that. So I think you might have a little bit more leadership, vocal leadership from the quarterback position. Maybe even like if you follow, lead by example kind of thing. There's all, he was reportedly, I've been told, people I trust, like in the football facility at Buttsmere late at night when everyone else is far, long gone, preparing for the Sugar Bowl. So I think all of that matters. You don't want to create a toxic environment around your quarterback the way that we did at times this year. Again, I think partly justifiably so. So I do think you factor all that in, not to pay the absurd NIL, being able to disperse that elsewhere to fix some other issues on your roster. A quarterback, you want to be able to have a quarterback that with a new offensive line, could potentially be able to create more outside the pocket and do more with his legs, escape some pressure, kind of mitigate some of the issues you might or might not have on the offensive line. You can potentially have 2 years Gunnar Stockton, and I just don't think you have the toxicity waiting to happen around Gunnar Stockton the way that you would with Carson Beck if he came back for another year. So there you go, guys. Again, think Carson Beck's a good quarterback. I think he's going to do good things in Miami. I hope the guy does well. No ill will whatsoever. But as far as the Georgia Bulldog football program is concerned, I think Georgia, in some way, shape, or form, is actually going to be better off in 2025 without Carson Beck. All right, guys, appreciate you. Thank you for checking us out. Again, I know it's been a while. We'll be back on here far more commonly over the course of the offseason. Try to have an episode or so every single week. Before you begin, make sure to check out the Glory UGA podcast for our full-length episodes. Wherever you get your podcasts, I have a ton of great coverage for you. Obviously, Georgia football. We're never straying too far from Georgia football. That'll be happening every single week on the podcast, even during the offseason. But we're also talking some Georgia basketball, Georgia baseball, just around the corner. Preseason number 4. Georgia basketball just knocked off back-to-back ranked opponents for the first time in my calculations since 2002, 2003. Been a long time. I think we're going to be ranked when the rankings come out here shortly on Monday. But appreciate you guys. And I'm Tyler. As always, go Dogs.
Man, is there going to be some property destroyed tonight. 26-21. Dogs on top.